The houses didn't fall, they moved. On the night of September 8th, 1900, 15 to 16 feet of ocean rose over the city of Galveston, Texas, in the span of a few hours. And the homes, the churches, the banks, the cotton warehouses that had made this one of the wealthiest cities in the United States simply tore free of their foundations and began to travel, west to east, driven by a wall of surge water at the front edge of a Category 4 hurricane. Compacting as they moved, timber, rooftops, telegraph poles, carriages, and the bodies of the people trapped inside them into a single churning mass 2 stories high that swept across the island, demolishing everything in its path before anyone inside had time to understand what was coming for them. There was no high ground. There was no seawall. There was no route off the island that wasn't already underwater and already killing people. By morning, somewhere between 6,000 and 12,000 people were dead. No one was ever able to count them exactly, because so many were swept into the Gulf of Mexico and never recovered. The city of Galveston, Texas, the second wealthiest city per capita in the United States, the third busiest port in the country, was erased from the map in a single night. Now here is the part that took more than a century to say clearly. This did not have to happen. 5 days before the storm made landfall, a meteorologist in Havana, Cuba, had already tracked it, named it, and predicted precisely where it was going. He sent his warning to the United States. It was stopped, deliberately, by the man whose job it was to protect the American coastline. And long before that warning was suppressed, the most trusted meteorologist in Galveston had already published an official assurance, in print, in his own name, that a disaster of this kind was impossible, that the city had nothing to fear, that anyone who thought otherwise was, in his own words, entertaining a crazy idea. Tens of thousands of people believed him. This is the full story of what happened in Galveston on September 8th, 1900, and of the 2 warnings, one scientific, one institutional, that were never allowed to reach the people who needed them most. To understand what was lost that night, you have to understand what Galveston was. In the year 1900, Galveston was not a quiet coastal town. It was a city of nearly 38,000 people and one of the most economically powerful places in the United States. The third busiest port in the country, the largest port west of New Orleans. 60% of the entire state of Texas's cotton crop moved through its docks every single year, loaded onto steamships bound for markets in New York, Liverpool, and Hamburg. The Strand, Galveston's central commercial boulevard, was known across the South as the Wall Street of the Southwest. Within a 5-block stretch of that single street, there were 26 documented millionaires. The city's per capita wealth was the second highest in the nation. Marble-fronted banks, gas-lit theaters, European-style restaurants serving imported wines to men who had built their fortunes in cotton and shipping and finance, and who had every reason to believe those fortunes were permanent. Galveston wore its prosperity with a particular kind of confidence, the kind that forms in a city told, repeatedly and officially, that nothing can touch it. That confidence had a specific author. In 1891, 9 years before the storm, the chief meteorologist of the United States Weather Bureau in Galveston, a man named Isaac Monroe Klein, published a bylined article in the Galveston Daily News. The subheadline read, "The Texas Coast Not Liable to Serious Damage." In it, Klein gave his official scientific opinion that a devastating hurricane striking Galveston was, a direct paraphrase of his own stated position, a crazy idea. He argued that the gradual slope of the seafloor off the Texas coast would dissipate any incoming surge before it reached the city. The geography of the Gulf of Mexico itself, he claimed, made Galveston essentially immune to the worst a hurricane could deliver. He said a seawall wasn't needed, that building one would be wasteful, that the city's natural setting was protection enough. Galveston believed him. What Klein either failed to recognize or failed to say was this: Galveston had no natural protection at all. It sat on a barrier island, a narrow strip of sand and silt, 27 miles long and no more than 3 miles wide at any point. Broadway, its highest street, peaked at 8.7 feet above sea level. The average elevation across the rest of the island was barely 4 feet. The open gulf sat on one side, Galveston Bay on the other. In a major storm, those two bodies of water would simply connect, and the city between them would disappear beneath them. No hills, no ridges, no elevation of any kind anywhere on that island. But Isaac Klein had said there was nothing to worry about. And in the summer of 1900, as the city hummed with commerce and the Gulf glittered in the August heat, no one in Galveston was worrying. They would pay for that certainty with everything they had. The deeper tragedy is not simply that they believed him. It's that by the time the truth was approaching across the Gulf, someone else had already found it. Someone with no stake in Galveston's confidence, no career built on the idea of its invulnerability, just a scientist in Havana with better data, better instincts, and a warning that the United States Weather Bureau had already decided would never be heard. By the first days of September 1900, a tropical storm was organizing over the Atlantic. It was moving west, building strength through the warm Caribbean. In a normally functioning warning network, a storm on this track would have been identified, assessed, and relayed to American coastal cities with enough lead time to prepare, to evacuate, to reinforce, to move people to safety. But 1900 was not a year of normal meteorological cooperation, because long before this storm ever threatened Texas, a second disaster had already been arranged, built entirely from professional arrogance, bureaucratic overreach, and the deliberate silencing of the people who had gotten it right. The Cuban meteorologists had been watching this storm since Sunday, September 3rd, 5 days before landfall. 5 days that could have meant organized evacuation, emergency preparation, lives saved at scale. The scientists tracking it operated out of the Belen Meteorological and Magnetic Observatory in Havana, one of the most capable hurricane monitoring institutions in the Western Hemisphere at that time. At its head was Father Lorenzo Ganguat, a Jesuit priest and one of the foremost hurricane forecasters alive. Father Ganguat understood the Gulf of Mexico the way a navigator understands a route he has traveled many times. He knew what September water temperatures could do to an already organized tropical system. His forecast was unambiguous. This storm would enter the Gulf, intensify rapidly, and strike the Texas coastline with full hurricane force. He knew where it was going. He knew what it would become, and he tried to tell the United States. He couldn't, because Willis Moore, the director of the United States Weather Bureau in Washington, had already ensured that Cuban weather predictions would never reach American meteorological stations. Moore's contempt for Cuban meteorology was not new and not subtle. He considered the Havana Observatory's methods inferior and its forecasters unqualified, a convenient position for a man who had built his professional authority on the supremacy of his own bureau. In what would prove to be a catastrophic act, Moore ordered the United States War Department to formally ban any and all weather-related messages from Cuban government telegraph lines from reaching the United States. Not filtered, not reviewed, banned entirely. He also halted the direct transmission of storm reports from the Bureau's Havana office to its own New Orleans station, cutting the most direct warning channel available for Gulf Coast disasters. Father Ganguat's only remaining option was to send his forecast directly to Washington, D.C. Washington received it. Washington set it aside. The United States Weather Bureau issued its own assessment instead, projecting the storm on a track that would carry it northeast, away from the Gulf, away from Texas, away from Galveston. The official forecast said the storm would recurve harmlessly into the open Atlantic. It was wrong. The Bureau knew the Cubans disagreed. It did not say so. No official hurricane warning was issued for Galveston. No evacuation was ordered. No emergency preparations of any meaningful scope were made. On September 7th, the day before the storm struck, hurricane warning pennants were raised atop the Weather Bureau's Levy building in Galveston. 2 flags. A standard issue signal. It was a warning in the technical, box-checking sense. But it carried none of the urgency Father Ganguat's forecast demanded, and no instructions accompanied it. No one was told to leave the island. No one was told that what was approaching was not a manageable tropical system, but a Category 4 hurricane on a direct collision course with the lowest elevation major city on the American coastline. On the morning of September 8th, Isaac Klein drove along the beach in his horse-drawn buggy and warned people to seek shelter in strong buildings. He would later, in his memoirs, describe this as a heroic intervention that saved thousands of lives. Historians who have examined those memoirs closely, including Eric Larson, whose meticulously researched account, Isaac's Storm, published in the year 2000, remains the definitive account of the disaster, have raised serious questions about Klein's self-portrait. The buggy story originated entirely in Klein's own retrospective account, the account of a man who had publicly declared this disaster impossible, and who had every professional reason to reshape what he did in the hours before it arrived. By late morning on September 8th, rain was driving hard across the island. The surf along the Gulf shore was breaking higher than it had any right to. The water in the streets nearest the beach was rising faster than anyone could explain, because what was coming was not a manageable storm, and because the one system designed to say so had been deliberately silenced. Not a single person in Galveston fully understood what the next 12 hours would cost them. What happened on September 8th, 1900, did not unfold over days. It happened in hours. By 10:30 in the morning, the Weather Bureau had officially placed Galveston under a storm warning. By then, heavy rain was already falling, and the surf was swelling in a way that made experienced observers uneasy. But the streets of Galveston were not empty. People stood on their porches, watching the sky. Families near the beach treated the rising waves as a spectacle, something to observe, not flee. Some had walked to the shoreline specifically to watch the surf break higher than usual. No one evacuated, and by the time the urgency became undeniable, the window for evacuation had already closed. The bridges connecting Galveston Island to the Texas mainland were flooding. Moving nearly 38,000 people off a 3-mile wide barrier island across bridges going underwater would have required a citywide evacuation effort that began hours earlier, hours before most residents understood there was anything to evacuate from. That window had opened on September 3rd, when Father Gangoit issued his warning. It had closed somewhere on the morning of September 8th. And in between those two moments, the United States Weather Bureau had held the door shut. By 3 in the afternoon, water covered nearly the entire island. Read that carefully. 3 in the afternoon, 5 full hours before the storm made official landfall, and Galveston was already flooded. Not the low-lying streets closest to shore, the entire island. The water pushing in from the Gulf and the water rising from Galveston Bay had already met across the 4-foot average elevation of the island's interior. The streets were gone. The ground floors of buildings across the entire city were filling, and the worst of the storm was still hours away. The surge arrived at 7:30 in the evening, not as a wave. The word wave does not capture what happened. The surge came as a sustained, pressurized wall of ocean, 15 to 16 feet above mean tide, driven ahead of the hurricane's center by the counterclockwise rotation of a storm that had been feeding all day on Gulf waters, still warm from a long summer. At 130 miles per hour, the wind alone was enough to demolish most residential structures on the island. But the wind was not the primary killer. The water was. A barrier island has no interior. It is the edge of a continent, a thin strip of land where open ocean meets bay, with no hills, no ridges, no natural elevation to slow an incoming surge. When 15 to 16 feet of driven ocean arrived at Galveston, the island did not flood from the shore inward. It submerged, all of it, simultaneously. In the higher streets, the water was 12 feet deep. In the lower sections near the bay, 15. Nowhere was it possible to stand. Nowhere was it shallow enough to move through. And then the debris wall came. On the western end of the island, facing the incoming storm directly, entire neighborhoods had already collapsed in the first hours of the surge. Homes constructed by some of the wealthiest families in Texas came apart in the water. Wood frame houses, no matter how solidly built, are not engineered for 15 feet of moving ocean. They broke, and as they broke, they moved. The current carried everything eastward. Lumber, roofing material, furniture, horses, carriages, entire building frames. All of it swept in the direction of the storm's track, compacting as it moved, driven by the surge and the screaming wind, until it became a churning mass of wreckage that survivors would later struggle to describe. A wall, 2 stories high, rolling across the island, obliterating structures the surge had left standing, erasing any remaining chance of survival for the people still inside them. There was no warning before it reached your door, no sound distinguishable from the general roar of the storm. One moment, the house beside you was still there. The next moment, there was nothing, and then the wall was moving through the space where it had been. Families climbed to rooftops and felt the rooftops lifting away from the houses beneath them. People lashed themselves to floating timbers and gripped each other through complete darkness, in wind that made speech impossible, unable to know how many of the people around them were still alive, unable to determine whether the storm was peaking or still building, unable to know anything except that the city they had lived in was gone, and the water showed no sign of stopping. The barometric pressure inside the storm bottomed out at 723.4 millimeters, the lowest reading ever recorded by a United States Weather Bureau station in history up to that point in time. The hurricane made official landfall near 8 o'clock in the evening. The dying had been underway for 5 hours. The storm moved through the night. The water held. Survivors clung to whatever remained above the surface, floating debris, the upper floors of the few buildings still standing, trees that had not yet been uprooted, with no way to know how many of the people they could hear nearby were still alive, no way to know whether what they were enduring was the worst of it or a prelude to something worse. By Sunday morning, September 9th, the surge had begun to recede. What it left behind stretched beyond the capacity of language. 7,000 buildings destroyed, 3,636 homes demolished to their foundations. Every single dwelling on the island, every one, had sustained some degree of damage. The streets, where streets could still be found, were buried under debris, 12, 15, and in places 20 feet deep. The smell reached people before the sight did. Salt water, mud, and something underneath all of it that told you, before your eyes had adjusted to the morning light, what the night had done to the living things it had caught. Isaac Klein survived. He found his wife Cora dead in the wreckage of their home. His brother Joseph had managed to pull Isaac's 3 daughters free of the storm. The man who had told Galveston for 9 years that nothing like this could come had survived the night to stand in the ruins of what his certainty had cost. And then the counting began. Nobody could count the dead, not in the first hours, not in any way that gave the survivors a number they could fully trust. The dead were everywhere and nowhere, inside collapsed houses, buried under mountains of debris, pinned beneath building frames that would take weeks to move. And thousands of them were simply gone, carried into the Gulf by the retreating surge, never to be found. The estimates that emerged in the days that followed could suggest the scale. They could not contain it. Somewhere between 6,000 and 12,000 people died in the Galveston hurricane of 1900. The figure most consistently cited in official records is 8,000. Even the lowest credible estimate, 6,000, means roughly 1 in 6 residents of the entire city died in a single night. The higher estimates suggest something closer to 1 in 3. These were not statistics in the detached sense the word implies when read at a safe distance. They were neighbors, families, children who had been on the beach watching the waves rise that same morning, alive and curious and entirely unaware of what the next few hours held. In the immediate aftermath, the question of what to do with the dead was itself a second catastrophe. The surviving population was overwhelmed and without resources. The city's infrastructure, its water supply, its roads, its communication lines to the mainland had been destroyed or critically damaged. There were no refrigeration facilities for bodies. There was no way to identify most of them. In the heat of a Gulf Coast September, decomposition began within hours, and the sheer number of dead made individual burial in any conventional sense impossible. The first plan was burial at sea. Bodies were loaded onto barges, taken miles out into the Gulf of Mexico, weighted with iron and stone, and submerged. The Gulf returned them. Within days, bloated and further decomposed, they began washing back onto the beaches of Galveston Island. The sea would not keep them. Burial at sea was abandoned. What followed was one of the most grim mass disposal operations in American history. Open-air funeral pyres were built across the island, not from any prepared materials, but from the debris of the storm itself. The same shattered timber that had been homes, churches, and commercial buildings became the fuel for burning the people those buildings had once sheltered. The dead were burned without identification, without funeral rites, without ceremony. In most cases, without anyone present who knew their names. Because in most cases, there was no one left who did. Workers assigned to collect bodies wore handkerchiefs soaked in camphor over their noses to blunt the smell. When volunteers ran out, which happened almost immediately, men were rounded up in the streets at gunpoint and at bayonet point and forced to perform the work. When a disaster reaches a certain scale, even the last dignity a society can offer its dead becomes something that must be compelled. Isaac Klein's 3 daughters survived, pulled from the storm by his brother Joseph. Cora Klein did not. The man who had spent 9 years publicly assuring Galveston of its own invulnerability lost his wife in the disaster he had declared could never come. In the days that followed, communications began reaching the mainland. The scope of what had happened in Galveston, a city that had been, 72 hours earlier, one of the most celebrated ports on the American coast, stunned a nation. Newspapers ran the numbers. Bodies on the beach. A city erased. Nearly 38,000 people who had gone to sleep on a Friday night in the safest, wealthiest city in Texas, waking to find, those who woke at all, that the world they had known was simply gone. But Galveston made a decision in those ruins that changed the history of American coastal engineering. It did not retreat. It did not relocate. It looked at the ocean that had just killed up to a third of its population and decided, with a resolve that is almost difficult to comprehend from the outside, to fight back. What it built next is one of the most remarkable engineering stories in American history, not only because of what was built, but because of what the decision required. A city in mourning, missing up to a third of its people, choosing to attempt something that had never been done anywhere in the world. By the autumn of 1900, Galveston faced a choice no American city had confronted quite so starkly. Retreat, abandon the island, accept that the geography which had made it rich had also made it indefensible. Or fight back, not against the next hurricane, which would certainly come, but against the specific conditions that had made this one so catastrophic. The absence of a barrier and the absence of elevation. Galveston chose to fight. What emerged from that choice was audacious in a way that is difficult to fully appreciate today. There were no precedents, no engineering literature describing how to build a coastal defense at this scale, no roadmap for physically raising an inhabited city. The engineers brought in to lead the solution had to invent it as they went, at a scope that had never been attempted anywhere in the world. The Engineering Commission, appointed to oversee the recovery, included 3 men. Henry Martin Robert, whose name you may recognize because he wrote Robert's Rules of Order, the parliamentary procedure guide still used in governing bodies around the world today. Alfred Noble, who would later become the national president of the American Society of Civil Engineers and would help determine the route of the Panama Canal. And Henry Clay Ripley. These were not bureaucrats assigned an impossible problem to manage quietly. They were among the finest civil engineers in the United States, and what they designed reflected it fully. Their recommendations were 2. Build a seawall and raise the entire city. The seawall was approved in court on September 7, 1901, exactly 1 year and 1 day after the storm. The first completed segment was finished on July 29, 1904. It stretched 3.3 miles along the Gulf-facing shore, stood 5 feet wide at its crest, and rose up to 17 feet above ground, a curved face of reinforced concrete set on wood pilings driven deep into the island's sand foundation. The curve was not decorative. It was engineering, designed to deflect incoming wave energy upward and outward rather than absorb it directly, reducing the lateral force transmitted to everything behind it. But the seawall alone was not enough. A 17-foot wall protects the land directly behind it. It does nothing for neighborhoods inland sitting below surge level, and nothing for the bay side of the island that a storm approaches from the opposite direction. The grade raising was the answer the seawall could not provide. The grade raising project ran from 1904 to 1911. Approximately 500 city blocks were elevated. 16.3 million cubic yards of sand were dredged from Galveston Bay and pumped through a network of pipes and canals across the island's interior, raising the surface elevation across the entire city. Fill depth ranged from a few inches at the already elevated Broadway to 11 feet in the lowest sections near the bay. Before any fill could be laid, 2,146 buildings had to be lifted, raised on hydraulic jacks, held in suspension while sand was pumped beneath them, then lowered carefully onto new, higher foundations. Streetcar tracks, water pipes, fire plugs. Every utility running beneath the streets had to be raised, extended, or entirely rebuilt to meet a ground level, now 8, 9, or 11 feet higher than it had been on September 7, 1900. Galveston was, in the most literal sense, picked up and set back down at a safer height. Then the storms returned. In 1909, a hurricane struck Galveston. In 1915, another, comparable in power to the 1900 disaster, the seawall held. The grade-raised surface drained. The death toll in 1915 was a fraction of what it had been 15 years earlier. The engineering worked. The audacity had been warranted. But while Galveston was busy building its concrete answer to the ocean, the other lesson of 1900, the one about warnings suppressed and authority protected at the cost of lives, was being handled with far less ambition. The seawall would be celebrated. The institutional failure that made the seawall necessary would be quietly filed away. Because acknowledging that failure would require admitting something, the United States Weather Bureau was not prepared to admit that the most preventable disaster in American history had been made possible, in part, by the man in charge of preventing it. After the storm, the United States Weather Bureau did not publicly acknowledge the role that the suppression of Cuban meteorological data had played in the disaster. Willis Moore, the man who had banned Cuban weather telegrams from American territory, who had dismissed Father Lorenzo Gangoit's accurate 5-day forecast as unworthy of relay, who had ensured that no official hurricane warning reached Galveston in time for meaningful action, continued as director of the United States Weather Bureau until 1904. He did not resign over Galveston. He resigned 4 years later, following a separate series of financial and ethical scandals entirely unrelated to the storm. The institutional reckoning, the suppression of the Cuban warning, demanded the public examination of how a bureau director had been permitted to censor the National Warning Network in the service of his own professional authority, never arrived in the way it should have. Isaac Klein was not dismissed. He was reassigned to New Orleans and continued his long career with the Weather Bureau for decades. He wrote memoirs. He described his buggy beach warning on the morning of September 8th as a heroic act that saved thousands of lives. He rebuilt his professional reputation, in part, on the claim that when the moment came, he had done everything possible. What his memoirs did not dwell on was the article from 1891, the 9 years of official, published assurance that a serious hurricane could never damage Galveston, the declaration that a seawall was unnecessary and fear was unwarranted, the crazy idea, his own words, that had allowed nearly 38,000 people to live on a sandbar at 4 feet above sea level with no coastal protection and no evacuation mechanism, and with no institutional capacity to act even if a warning had somehow managed to get through. Eric Larson's definitive account of the storm, published in the year 2000 under the title Isaac's Storm, was what brought the full dimensions of the institutional failure into clear public view for the first time. Larson documented both the suppression of Cuban forecasting under Willis Moore and the unresolved historical questions surrounding Klein's self-reported conduct in the hours before the storm. The book forced a reckoning more than a century after the disaster, with a catastrophe that official history had long preferred to frame as an unpredictable act of nature rather than an institutional failure with an identifiable author. It was not unpredictable. Father Gangoit predicted it accurately, 5 days in advance, and sent his forecast toward Washington, where it was buried by a man who had already decided that Cuban expertise had no standing in American meteorology. The disaster was not a hurricane plus bad luck. It was a hurricane, plus an institution that had decided its own judgment, superseded the evidence. That the people best positioned to challenge its conclusions could be silenced, and that the consequences of being wrong would fall on the 38,000 people living on 4 feet of sand who had been told to trust the man in charge. The seawall was the engineering answer. Galveston built it brilliantly, but the harder question, what it takes to build a warning system that cannot be silenced by the person whose career depends on not hearing what it says, is not answered by concrete. And that question did not stay in Galveston. The Galveston seawall still stands today. You can walk its length, watch the gulf from its crest, feel the concrete under your feet, and understand something of the will it took to build it. It is 17 feet high, the same height as when the first segment was finished in 1904, and it is one of the most visited engineering landmarks on the Texas coast. What is not as visible and not as resolved is the broader pattern that the 1900 storm first exposed in full. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina made landfall near New Orleans as a Category 3 storm, weaker by wind speed than the Galveston hurricane. The surge it produced reached 27 feet in some locations. The surge killed more people than the wind, more than the rain, more than any other single factor in that disaster. Official messaging before landfall focused heavily on wind category. The surge received less emphasis, less urgency, less public attention. The people who stayed because they had survived previous storms, because they trusted the Category 3 designation to tell them what they needed to know, many of them drowned. In 2008, Hurricane Ike made landfall at Galveston, the city with the seawall. The surge reached 20 feet in some areas north of the island on the bayside, behind the wall, in the areas it was never designed to protect. The National Weather Service issued a statement warning of certain death for those who remained in the surge zone. Many stayed. The storm killed more than 200 people in Texas. In 2017, Hurricane Harvey stalled over Houston and southeastern Texas and dropped more rainfall over a single urban area than any storm in recorded American history. The flooding was catastrophic in scale and duration. The warning was there. The preparation was not commensurate with what the data showed. Storm surge versus wind category. Warning issued versus warning believed. The data showing one thing and the official communication conveying another. The gap between what the evidence demonstrates and what the public understands about what it means for them, specifically, personally, in terms of what they need to do, is not a gap that better science alone has closed. Galveston in 1900 was not a freak of history. It was the first clearly documented instance of a pattern the United States has repeated, in varying forms, in varying cities, across more than a century. The forecasting is incomparably better now than anything Father Gangoit had access to. The gap between the data and the decision, between the warning issued and the warning actually heard, persists. The seawall got built. The warning system improved. The pattern is not gone. On the morning of September 9th, 1900, Galveston woke to silence and wreckage. Between 6,000 and 12,000 people were dead. The wealthiest city in Texas had been returned to sand, and 2 of the men most directly responsible for what had happened continued their careers. One reassigned, one eventually resigned over something unrelated, without the public reckoning the scale of the disaster demanded. The seawall went up, the city was raised, the engineering answer was built, and built brilliantly. But the warning Father Lorenzo Gangoit sent from Havana on September 3rd, 1900, the warning that was stopped in Washington, that never reached Galveston, that could have changed everything, is still worth sitting with. Because the question it carries has never expired. Who holds the information? Who decides whether it travels? And who pays when those 2 things are not the same person? That question is what Epicenter Files is here to ask. If it's one worth answering, subscribe. Stay for the next one. There are more of these stories. There are always more of these stories.